I never meant to end up in that graveyard at all. I had taken a wrong turn off a narrow back road in northern Minnesota on a cold October evening in 2019. I was 31 at the time, driving alone after spending the day wandering through small towns and old trails. I liked being out in quiet places where the noise of everything else dropped away. But that night, the quiet felt different, felt too heavy, like the air itself was watching me. The sun had already slipped under the tree line, leaving a pale blue glow that made everything look colder than it actually was. My phone had lost signal miles back, and the GPS screen was frozen. I kept driving until the road turned to gravel and then to nothing but hard dirt. I should have turned back as soon as I saw the old iron fence on my right. It was tall, rusted, and bent in some places, almost like frozen ribs sticking out of the ground. Behind it was a graveyard that didn't look like anyone had cared for it in decades. The ground inside was uneven, covered in dry, dead grass. The headstones leaned in strange angles, some almost falling forward, others buried so deep in the ground that only the tops showed. The sky had grown darker by then, and the dead grass shifted in the wind like thin fingers brushing against each other. I slowed the car without even meaning to, drawn to how silent the place was. No birds, no insects, just a cold breeze and the sound of gravel under my tires. The road curved beside the graveyard and then slipped into a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a cabin. It was small, old, and built out of dark, weathered wood that had dried and split in long lines. The roof sagged slightly in the center. A thin metal chimney stuck out at an angle. Even from the car, I could see that the windows were dirty and warped, reflecting nothing. It looked abandoned but not destroyed, like someone had simply walked away from it and no one had ever come back. I stopped the car because I didn't have much choice. The temperature had dropped fast, and fog was beginning to roll through the trees. The last bit of daylight was sinking away, and the idea of trying to drive back through the woods in the dark without a working GPS didn't make sense. My fuel gauge was low. My phone was dead. Everything felt like it was pushing me toward the cabin whether I liked it or not. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a wall. It wasn't the normal kind of cold. It was sharper, almost chemical. My breath came out in white clouds that disappeared fast. The air smelled like wet soil and old metal. The graveyard behind me stretched into the trees, and for a moment the uneven stones looked like hunched figures standing between the trunks. I forced myself not to stare too long. Something about looking at them made my stomach twist. The cabin door was slightly open, like someone had pushed it and never bothered to close it. The wood around the handle was scratched, not like animal scratches, but like something had tried to force the door open from the outside. The hinges creaked when I touched it, the sound echoing in the empty clearing in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. Inside, the air was even colder, felt trapped, like it hadn't moved for years. Dust clung to everything, thick enough that it looked like frost in the weak light coming through the windows. The cabin had one main room and a small back room that looked like a storage space. The floorboards were dark and warped. There was a small wooden table with a single chair next to it. A pot-bellied stove in the corner looked like it hadn't been used in half a century. But the thing that bothered me the most was the smell. It wasn't rot. It wasn't mold. It was something metallic, dry, and sour all at once. Something that stuck in the back of my throat. I tried to ignore it as I set my backpack down. There were signs that someone had lived there, but none of them recent. A torn jacket thrown over the chair. An old tin can of beans left on the table with the label faded to almost nothing. A pair of boots half hidden under the bed frame. The bed itself had no sheets, just an old thin mattress with dark stains on the edges. I didn't want to think about what caused them. I didn't want to think about who had last slept there, or why they left in such a hurry. I tried to settle in for a while. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, listening to the wind push against the cabin. But after a few minutes, I started hearing something else. A steady tapping, slow, rhythmic, not loud, but clear enough to follow. At first, I thought it was branches hitting the roof. Then I realized it was coming from the direction of the graveyard. I held still, listening, every muscle in my body tightening as I counted each tap, for seconds apart, over and over. The tapping stopped suddenly. The silence after it felt heavier than before, like the cabin itself had stopped breathing. I stood up slowly and walked to the window on the graveyard side. The glass was streaked with years of dirt, but I could still see through it. At first, I didn't notice anything. The graveyard was still, the dead grass shifting slightly in the wind. But then I saw it. Something dark near the far corner where the fence bent inward. A shape, a figure, not moving, just standing. It was too far to see details, but I could tell it was a human shape. My chest tightened. I kept staring, but the shape didn't shift, didn't lean, didn't walk, just stood there like it had been waiting for something. I stepped back from the window, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. I told myself it could be a tree stump, or a broken headstone, or even someone visiting the graves late. But none of those things made sense. None of them explained the tapping. None of them explained the feeling crawling down my spine. A slow, steady awareness that I wasn't alone out there. The hours dragged by. The fog thickened outside until I couldn't see the graveyard at all. The tapping didn't return, but that somehow felt worse. Silence is louder when you expect something to break it. I sat awake, jumping at every shift of the wood, every groan of the wind under the roof. The metallic smell got stronger the longer I stayed. I kept tasting it in the back of my mouth. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not heavy, not rushed, slow, careful. They came from outside, circling the cabin. My heart thudded against my ribs so hard it hurt. I held my breath, counting each step as it moved around the walls. When the steps reached the window nearest to me, they stopped. The air went still. Even the wind stopped blowing. I didn't move for a long time. I didn't blink, didn't breathe deeply. I stared at the dark window until my eyes burned. But nothing pressed against the glass. Nothing knocked. Nothing broke in. Eventually, the footsteps started again, slower this time, moving toward the back of the cabin. I heard something brush against the wall, like clothing scraping old wood. Then everything went silent again. I didn't sleep at all. I waited inside that cabin, with the cold air sinking deeper into my bones, until the first faint gray light crept through the trees. As soon as I saw even the weakest daylight, I grabbed my things and left. When I stepped outside, the clearing looked different. The fog had lifted just enough for me to see the graveyard again. The shape I saw the night before was gone. But near the fence, I noticed something I hadn't seen when I first arrived. Footprints, a single trail of them. They led from the graveyard straight toward the cabin and circled it. The prints were deep, pressed hard into the soft dirt like someone had been dragging their feet. But the part that still makes my skin crawl even now, there were no footprints leading back to the graveyard, only the ones coming toward me. I didn't wait to figure out what that meant. I drove until I reached the main road, then kept going until I found a gas station with people, noise, and normal air that didn't feel like it was pressing against my lungs. I never went back to look for that cabin. I never tried to find out who or what walked from the graveyard to it that night. I just know that whatever was outside circled the walls slowly, listening to every breath I took, and for reasons I will never understand, it didn't try to come inside. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone and everything is quiet, I still hear that slow tapping in the back of my mind, the steady rhythm coming from the graveyard fence. And even though nothing followed me home, I always check my windows before I try to sleep, just to be sure. I had rented the cabin for a week because I wanted a place where I could clear my head and stay away from the noise of the city. It was the autumn of 2019, and I had been working overtime for months in a small logistics office in northern England. My nerves were worn thin, and I felt tired in a way that sleep never seemed to fix. When I found the listing for a cheap cabin near the edge of Kielder Forest, I booked it without thinking too deeply. It looked old, simple, and quiet, which was all I wanted. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow gravel path that twisted through thick trees. The moment I arrived, the cold air hit me harder than I expected. The trees around the cabin were tall and dark, and the ground was covered with wet leaves that stuck to my boots. The place had a lonely feel, the kind that made you aware of every sound around you. When I stepped inside, the smell of old wood and dust filled my nose. Everything was basic. One small bed, a weak electric heater, a wobbly table, and a single window that looked out toward the forest. I spent the first 2 days trying to relax. I went on short walks, boiled simple meals on a small stove, and tried to read a book I had brought with me. But even in daylight, the forest gave me a strange feeling. It wasn't anything dramatic, just the sense that the trees were too close and the silence felt too deep, as if something was listening. I pushed the feeling away because I didn't want to ruin my own break. On the third night, the weather turned colder. A light rain kept hitting the roof, making a steady tapping sound. I tried to sleep early, but I kept waking up. At around 2 in the morning, I lay staring at the ceiling, unable to settle my mind. That was when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to snap my attention awake. It sounded like someone stepping on wet leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a fox. The area was full of wildlife, and the owner had mentioned that seeing animals was common. But the steps were slow, spaced apart, and heavier than what a small animal would make. Every few seconds, I heard another shift of leaves, like someone was walking in a careful, deliberate way. I stayed completely still in the bed, trying to breathe quietly. The sound moved from somewhere to the left of the cabin to the backside, near the window. I didn't get up to look. I didn't want anything to see movement inside. Instead, I stayed there, staring at the shadows on the ceiling while the steps continued. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I lay awake for hours before I finally fell asleep. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was muddy and covered with leaves, so I couldn't tell if there were footprints or not. I tried not to think about it, but the next night, the same thing happened. The steps returned, slow and spaced apart, circling the cabin the same way as before. Every time I thought the sound had faded away, it came back a minute later, like whoever or whatever was out there kept pausing and listening. By the fourth day, my nerves were worn thin. I kept telling myself it was probably a large animal, maybe even a person hiking nearby. Yet I couldn't explain why the footsteps always came at night and why they always circled around the cabin. I considered leaving early, but I kept trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I didn't want to waste the money I had already paid. That evening, the sky turned darker earlier than usual. Heavy clouds covered the last bit of light, and the forest looked like it swallowed everything around it. I decided to stay inside and keep the lights on. I sat close to the tiny heater because the air had become sharp and cold. Around midnight, I heard a new sound. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was something brushing against the outer wall, slow and rough, like fabric scraping wood. Then I heard a faint pressure against the window. I felt every muscle in my body freeze. I didn't stand up. I didn't move. I stayed low on the bed, watching the faint outline of the window from the corner of my eye. The scraping sound stopped. Then the footsteps returned, heavier than before. They moved from the back of the cabin to the front door. I stared at the door, waiting to see the handle move, but it never did. After a while, the steps drifted off into the forest. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. At sunrise, I packed my bag and decided to leave immediately. The path out of the woods was long, and the cabin's phone signal was weak. I wanted to reach the main road before evening. Before leaving, I walked around the cabin one last time, even though I didn't want to. That was when I noticed something on the wall beside the window. The wood had fresh scratches, long ones, as if someone had dragged something sharp across it. The edges of the scratches were clean and bright compared to the weathered wood. My stomach tightened. That wasn't an animal. There was no doubt in my mind. I hurried down the gravel path with my bag, trying not to look behind me. The forest felt different in daylight, but it still carried an uncomfortable stillness. I walked fast until the path started narrowing toward a small wooden bridge I had crossed earlier in the week. When I approached it, I slowed down for a moment, not because I wanted to, but because the mud around the bridge looked disturbed, flattened in a way that suggested someone had stood there for a long time. On the other side of the bridge, I saw something that made my chest tighten even more. A long, thin branch had been placed across the middle of the path. It wasn't lying there naturally. It was placed intentionally, straight and level, like someone wanted to see if it would be moved. I stepped over it carefully and kept going. I didn't stop again. By the time I reached the main road, my hands were shaking from the cold and from everything that had happened. A delivery van drove by after 20 minutes, and I waved it down. The driver gave me a confused look as he stopped, probably wondering why someone was walking alone so early. I didn't explain anything. I just needed a ride back to the nearest village. That evening, after I finally returned home, the fear didn't fade. In the days that followed, I went through every possible explanation in my mind. Maybe it was someone wandering the woods. Maybe a local person lived nearby and liked to move around at night. Maybe someone was hunting or camping and happened to walk past the cabin. But the slow, careful steps circling the place, the scratches on the wall, the branch placed across the path, none of that felt random. None of it felt like an accident or a coincidence. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. Every night before the footsteps started, the forest around the cabin went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. No birds, no rustling, nothing. It was the kind of silence that comes when something is close enough for everything else to hide. I never reported the incident. I never contacted the owner. I deleted the listing from my browser history so I wouldn't be tempted to look at it again. I learned something during that week, something simple but heavy. Not everything dangerous has to be supernatural or dramatic. Sometimes it's just a person or a presence or something that watches without speaking. Something that moves slowly, waits patiently, and chooses places where people are alone. I don't stay in remote cabins anymore. I don't go on solo trips into forests. Whenever I pass through countryside roads, I keep my eyes away from the tree lines because sometimes I feel like something is standing there, still and quiet, the same way it stood outside that cabin. And every time I hear leaves shift under someone's boots, even in a crowded street, my mind goes straight back to those nights in the cold woods, when something walked around my cabin with slow, heavy steps, as if it was trying to learn the shape of me through the walls. That was the week I understood that real fear doesn't come from stories or creatures. It comes from knowing someone was there, close enough to touch the window without ever showing themselves, and knowing I left just before they decided to do more than walk. I never imagined that a weekend trip to Grandma's old cabin would turn into one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. It was the summer of 2007, and I was 19, my cousin Lucas 21. Grandma's cabin wasn't in the thick of the woods. It sat just outside a small town in northern Montana, near a quiet stretch of forest that locals always warned us about. She had retired there after leaving her home in the city, wanting peace and quiet. Lucas and I weren't exactly into peace and quiet, but it seemed like a good escape from our busy lives. Grandma's cabin was an odd mix of rustic charm and military precision. She had spent 5 years in the army during the late 60s and had carried a certain discipline into her civilian life. Everything had a place, and you could tell she liked things exactly so. The cabin was small, maybe 25 by 30 feet, with a wide porch, a stone fireplace, and walls lined with old hunting trophies and maps of the surrounding forests. The furniture was sturdy, simple, and well-maintained. Nothing fancy, but functional and dependable. We arrived in the early afternoon, the sun filtering through the tall pines surrounding the cabin. Grandma had already stocked the pantry with canned goods, coffee, and a few fresh vegetables. Lucas immediately claimed the bigger bed in the loft, while I took the smaller one below. Grandma had this habit of leaving things perfectly organized, from the kitchen knives lined up on the counter to the firewood stacked in neat rows outside. Even the old rifle leaning against the corner of the living room looked like it had been cleaned yesterday. That first night, the air felt unusually thick. The forest around the cabin was alive with the sounds of insects and distant owls. But there was also an undercurrent of something else, a sharpness that made the hairs on my arms rise. I brushed it off as paranoia, blaming the isolation and my overactive imagination. Lucas didn't seem concerned. He was always the braver one, or at least the one willing to pretend he was. By the second day, I began noticing strange signs around the cabin. I found deep, uneven footprints in the soft soil behind the cabin, far too big to be either mine or Lucas's. The tracks led into the forest but didn't return. I also noticed the gate to the small chicken pen had been opened, and a couple of hens were missing. Grandma had mentioned that the forest had wild animals, but these signs seemed too deliberate. That night, I barely slept. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's thin walls, and there was this faint, rhythmic scraping sound outside, like metal on stone. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch against the cabin, but the sound persisted. At one point, I heard something heavy moving across the porch. When I turned on my flashlight, nothing was there. Lucas was snoring upstairs, blissfully unaware. The following morning, I decided to explore the surrounding forest, hoping some daylight would ease my mind. Lucas joined me reluctantly. He said he was curious but insisted we stick close to the trail. As we walked, I noticed more signs that someone, or something, had been near the cabin recently. Twigs were snapped unnaturally, and I spotted what looked like tire marks, half buried in the muddy ground. They were from a four-wheel drive vehicle, fresh enough that it couldn't have been last week. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some hunters had passed by. Maybe the forest rangers were doing something. But deep down, I felt a tightening in my chest. There was a precision to the disturbance, something too careful to be random. By the time we returned to the cabin, the unease had grown into something more tangible. Lucas went to gather firewood, and I stayed behind, pacing the porch. That's when I noticed the window nearest the living room had been smeared with something dark. It was hard to tell in the daylight, but it looked like it could have been dried blood. My stomach churned. I checked inside. Nothing was out of place, nothing broken. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That evening, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something metallic. I lit a fire in the fireplace, hoping the warmth and light would settle my nerves. Lucas was sitting on the floor, sharpening a hunting knife he'd found in the cabin. We didn't talk much, words felt pointless. Outside, the scraping noises had returned, slower this time, deliberate, circling the cabin like a predator assessing its prey. Hours passed. The sun disappeared completely, leaving only the dim glow of our fire. Then I heard it, a low, grating sound, almost like someone breathing heavily. It came from the back of the cabin, where the trees grew closest. My heart pounded, and I could feel sweat running down my spine. Lucas had heard it too because he suddenly stood, alert, knife in hand. We didn't call out. There was no one to call, and yelling seemed dangerous. Instead, we moved quietly, pressing ourselves against the walls, scanning the shadows outside. That's when I saw him, a figure crouched near the tree line, wearing dark clothes and a cap, his posture rigid, like he was trained to move without being noticed. The moonlight hit the barrel of a rifle he was holding. He wasn't hunting animals. He was watching us. My mind raced. Lucas and I remembered stories Grandma had told of isolated crimes in the area. Small-town feuds, people hiding out in the woods. We weren't exactly experienced in survival situations, but Grandma's cabin was fortified in small ways. Heavy locks, thick walls, even an old trapdoor under the rug by the fireplace that led to a shallow storage cellar. We moved silently, one eye on the figure outside, the other on the trapdoor. It felt like hours, though it was only minutes, before we finally climbed down into the storage cellar. It was dark, cramped, and smelled faintly of mold, but it was safe, away from sight. We crouched there, barely breathing, listening to the man circling the cabin above us. He stayed for a long time, the scraping of his boots echoing through the night. Then suddenly silence. My ears rang. Lucas and I waited another half hour before daring to peek out. The man was gone, leaving only disturbed dirt and broken branches behind. Morning brought relief but no answers. The forest seemed peaceful again, the tracks from last night partially washed away by rain that had begun to fall in the early hours. We waited for hours, packing quietly, preparing to leave. When we finally got in Grandma's old truck and drove away, we didn't look back. Grandma never spoke of the incident. She just asked if we'd enjoyed the trip, her voice calm, almost knowing. It was only later that I realized what she had been preparing us for all along. The discipline, the careful organization, the readiness for the unexpected. That cabin wasn't just a place to escape. It was a training ground for staying alive when danger was close but invisible. Years later, I would understand the precision in the way that man had moved, the way he had circled, waited, and left without a trace. He was likely ex-military himself, methodical and patient. But because of the preparations my grandmother had made, Lucas and I had survived unharmed. The experience left me shaken, hyper-aware of how quickly life could change in the isolated wilderness, and taught me to respect the silence and shadows of places like that cabin. We never returned to that part of Montana, but every time I think of it, I can feel the cold, damp air of the cellar, hear the scraping of boots on the porch, and remember the heavy, tense minutes where every decision mattered. It was real, it was terrifying, and we came out alive because of foresight, discipline, and a little luck that I would never take for granted again. I was on my fourth week patrolling the dense stretches of the Amazon rainforest in northern Brazil, near a small tributary that locals called Rio Maricana. The year was 2019, and I was 32, a federal cop assigned to environmental crimes. I had volunteered for this post hoping to escape the claustrophobic bureaucracy of the city, but the jungle had a way of making even the strongest nerves fray. The humidity was nearly suffocating, and the constant rain made every inch of the forest slick and treacherous. I had been stationed in a small wooden ranger cabin built decades ago by a now-defunct forestry project. It had survived only because the forest itself seemed to shelter it from the worst of the storms. The cabin was isolated, nestled between two large trees, with a narrow path barely wide enough for a single ATV. It had a single room, a small kitchen, and a loft where I slept on a sagging cot. The walls were lined with old maps, and the corners were filled with insect nets, rusted tools, and stacks of paper documenting forest patrols from years past. That morning, I woke to the sound of relentless rain tapping on the tin roof. Water seeped through tiny cracks in the walls, forming small streams along the floorboards. I had brewed a weak cup of coffee over the old propane stove and sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the puddles forming under the window. The forest outside seemed alive, more ominous than ever, with the low hum of insects and the occasional crack of distant thunder. I had been on alert for weeks because of reports of illegal logging and poaching in this area. The rainforest, despite its vastness, was riddled with small trails where people moved unnoticed. I often had to hike for hours to inspect the logging camps, and I carried a handgun more out of habit than belief that I'd ever need it. The isolation of the cabin always weighed on me, but that morning, the atmosphere felt heavier. I decided to make a quick patrol along a narrow trail near the river. The rain had made the ground muddy, sucking at my boots with every step. The trees, massive and wet, pressed close together, and the smell of wet earth mixed with decaying leaves filled my nostrils. As I walked, I noticed something odd, a set of footprints partially obscured by mud. They were too large to be from a local guide and seemed fresh. My heart rate increased slightly. Footprints alone weren't alarming, but there was a deliberate spacing, a rhythm that suggested someone moving with purpose, not just wandering. I followed the trail, moving cautiously. The rain hammered down harder, soaking me in minutes. My uniform clung to my skin, and the forest noises grew louder in the wet air. Then I saw it, a glint of something unnatural beneath a thick tangle of vines and leaves. As I moved closer, the outline became horrifyingly clear. A body, partially submerged in a shallow pool of rainwater, lying face down. The clothes were torn, soaked, and the skin pale with a grayish tint. It was impossible to tell how long the person had been there, but the sight made my stomach churn. I knelt carefully, trying to make sense of it. The body was male, probably in his late 20s, judging by the worn sneakers and a faded backpack beside him. There were deep bruises on his arms and neck, likely from a struggle. My training kicked in. I documented the scene in my mind, careful not to disturb any evidence. The man's face was partially buried in the mud, and his hair, matted with rain and debris, hid most features. I checked for a pulse reflexively. Nothing. Dead. I realized immediately that I needed help, but calling for backup wasn't simple here. The cabin had a satellite phone, but even that could be unreliable in the constant rain and canopy coverage. I radioed my base, giving coordinates and a brief description. The response was slow. The operators cautioned me to stay put and wait. That left me alone with the body, in the heart of a rainforest that felt alive and threatening, every rustle of leaves a potential hazard. The hours stretched. The rain never eased, and my clothes were saturated, clinging to me like a second skin. I decided to clear a small area around the body to make it visible from above, just in case a rescue team needed a landing spot. The mud sucked at my boots, the rain turned the soil into thick clay, and the mosquitoes were relentless, biting through even my raincoat. The man's backpack was partially open. Inside, I found some survival gear, a small journal, and a water bottle. The journal was soaked, but some pages clung together enough to see hurried writing. Records of someone tracking illegal activity in the forest, possibly loggers or poachers. By late afternoon, the storm had let up slightly. The forest still dripped water from every leaf, and the air was heavy and wet. The clouds hung low, casting a dim light over everything. I heard the faint sound of rotors. A helicopter. The base had dispatched a team after finally getting my coordinates confirmed. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by unease. Who was this man? What had happened to him? When the helicopter arrived, the team carefully extracted the body. They moved with efficiency, wrapping the corpse in a protective tarp, documenting everything for forensic analysis. I followed behind, feeling an odd emptiness. I had expected some answers, but there were none yet. All I had were the footprints, the bruises, and the soggy journal. Back at the cabin, I cleaned up as best I could. The floorboards were still damp, and the smell of wet wood and mud lingered in the air. I reviewed my notes, the journal, and the photos I had taken of the scene. There were clear indications that the man had been tracking something illegal, possibly a gang of poachers or loggers, and someone had caught up with him. I realized the forest was not only isolating but ruthless. One wrong move and a person could vanish without a trace. The night fell, thick and silent, broken only by the occasional drip of water and distant calls of unseen creatures. I sat in the cabin, listening, reflecting. I felt the weight of the forest, its vastness, its indifference. Yet there was also a strange clarity in the isolation, a way the rain and the mud and the heavy trees forced you to pay attention, to respect your environment. The next morning, the helicopter returned with 2 investigators. We went over the scene again, following the trail, examining footprints and evidence. With careful planning and cross-referencing satellite imagery, we managed to locate the remains of a small illegal logging camp a few kilometers from the cabin. It was abandoned, but there were signs of a struggle, broken tools, scattered supplies, a few bloodstains. The pieces were coming together. The man had stumbled onto something dangerous, something people wanted to hide, and it had cost him his life. In the weeks that followed, the investigation continued. The camp led to arrests, though the full story of what had happened to the young man remained murky. I stayed at the cabin, continuing patrols, feeling a cautious sense of accomplishment that justice, however delayed, was being served. The forest remained the same, silent, wet, and indifferent. But I had survived it, faced the raw, real danger without fantasy or superstition, and come out with a story I would carry for the rest of my life. By the time I left the cabin, the rain had finally stopped. The forest smelled like fresh earth and green leaves. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, golden streams. I packed my gear, locked the cabin door, and took one last look at the trail I had walked countless times, knowing the forest would keep its secrets as fiercely as it always had, but also knowing that I had witnessed one of its harsh truths and survived. It was the summer of 2003, and I had just turned 27. I had been driving cross-country for weeks, stopping wherever I felt like it, taking photos and sketching in my notebook, trying to escape the constant hum of city life in Boston. That was when I decided to take a detour into northern Minnesota. I had heard about a small, isolated cabin in the dense pines near the edge of a state forest. The cabin had been owned by a retired logger named Carl, who had passed away the previous winter. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it, imagining a week of solitude. Just me, the trees, and the faint smell of pine sap in the air. The road leading to the cabin was rough. My old Subaru groaned as I drove over gravel and potholes, and the further I went, the narrower and less maintained the path became. The trees leaned in on both sides of the road, making a kind of green tunnel that blocked out almost all sunlight. By the time I finally parked the car, I had to walk the last half-mile, carrying my backpack and a small duffel with food, water, and a few essentials. The air was damp and smelled of earth and wet leaves, the kind of smell that sticks to your shoes and your clothes. The cabin itself was smaller than I had expected. It was made of rough, weathered logs, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. A thin plume of smoke curled from the old brick chimney, though I doubted anyone had been there for months. The windows were dusty, and the door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and something older, like dust and old paper. Sunlight barely filtered in through the grimy windows, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I set my things down and started exploring. The living area had a small wood stove, a threadbare rug, and a table covered in old, yellowing newspapers. On the shelves were jars of what looked like pickled vegetables, long past their prime, and a few canned goods that seemed like they had been there for years. The bedroom was tiny, just enough for a narrow bed and a small dresser. The bathroom had a sink and a toilet, though I wasn't sure if the plumbing still worked. Everything smelled faintly of mildew, and there were small spiders crawling along the corners of the ceiling. The first night was uncomfortable. I built a small fire in the stove and sat in the dark, listening to the wind whispering through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It was one of those nights where every small sound feels amplified. The snap of a branch outside, the rustle of leaves, the hum of insects. I tried to read a book, but my mind kept wandering, imagining the forest outside as something alive, almost watching me. Still, I told myself it was just the isolation, nothing more. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, almost suffocatingly dense in some parts, and the further I walked, the more I felt like I was stepping into a different world. Sunlight barely reached the forest floor in some areas, and the air was cooler, damp with moss and decomposing leaves. I came across a small creek, its water clear but running fast, and I filled my bottle to keep it for drinking later. As I wandered, I realized I had no cell signal, no bars at all. That was both exhilarating and frightening. If something went wrong, no one would know where I was. That night, I slept uneasily. Around midnight, I woke to a loud noise outside, something heavy hitting the cabin. My heart raced and I froze, listening. The sound came again, another thud, then scraping along the side of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the door. The forest was dark and empty. I couldn't see anything, but the smell hit me first. Wet earth and something else, metallic. My stomach churned. I checked the perimeter of the cabin with the flashlight, scanning the trees and underbrush, but there was no one. Nothing moved, but I knew something had been there. Over the next 2 days, things kept happening. I would find small signs that someone or something had been around. Footprints in the mud near the cabin, a small branch broken and lying near the door. My firewood shifted slightly. Every time I went into the forest, I felt like I was being watched. The feeling never left. I stopped leaving the cabin after dark. I made sure to lock the door, even though it was just an old wooden latch, and I kept the stove burning at night so the cabin stayed warm and the firelight made the shadows less threatening. By the 4th day, I realized I hadn't eaten much. My nerves made food unappealing. I tried to read my book, but I couldn't focus. Every time I heard a sound outside, a bird, a snapping branch, or even the wind, I would jump. I knew logically that the forest was mostly empty, that bears or wolves were more likely than people, but something felt wrong. That's when I noticed the tracks again. This time, they led from the edge of the forest straight to the side of the cabin and then disappeared. There were no other exits, no other entrances nearby. Whoever or whatever had been walking there had been moving silently. I spent the next morning carefully packing my things. I couldn't stay another night. I had learned the hard way that isolation can magnify fear, make small, harmless things seem dangerous. As I prepared to leave, I double-checked everything, making sure my backpack was secure and my car was ready to go. When I finally stepped outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I didn't stop walking until the cabin was behind me, hidden by the trees. The drive back to the main road felt surreal. The gravel path stretched on endlessly, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing. The isolation, the sounds at night, the footprints, they were gone behind me, left to the forest. By the time I reached a small town near the highway, I stopped at a diner to eat, my hands still trembling, my stomach tight. Felt like I had returned from a different world. I later learned from the locals that Carl, the original owner, had lived alone for decades. They said he never had family nearby and that sometimes strange people would wander near his cabin, but nothing violent had ever happened. I realized then that the fear I felt was part instinct, part imagination. The isolation of the cabin, the density of the forest, the unfamiliar sounds. All of it had combined to make my mind play tricks on me. Looking back, I don't regret going. The experience taught me the raw edge of solitude, how quickly our minds fill in the blanks when we're alone in a strange place. I learned to respect the forest, to prepare better for isolation, and to trust my instincts. That cabin in Minnesota still exists somewhere in the woods, weathered and quiet, and I know I will never return. The fear wasn't because of ghosts or fairy tales. It was real, built from the shadows, the isolation, and the sense that the world was bigger than I was. I never forgot the smell of the forest, the creaking floorboards, or the tracks outside the cabin. And sometimes, when I drive through a dense forest or hear a strange sound at night, I remember that week and feel the same edge of fear. But now, it's tempered with understanding. I made it out, I survived, and I carried the lesson home. Solitude is powerful, and the mind can be as terrifying as any creature in the woods, but it's not invincible. You have to move carefully, observe, and never let fear freeze you. That summer in Minnesota, that old cabin, taught me more about survival and myself than any city life ever could. I had just turned 31 when I decided to take a break from the city. My job as a structural engineer had been consuming me for years, and the constant hum of traffic, fluorescent lights, and the endless deadlines had begun to grind me down. I remembered a small cabin my uncle had built in the northern woods of Maine, not far from the Canadian border. It was an old, weathered place, isolated on a dirt road that disappeared into thick pine forests. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager, but the memory of the place, cracked windows, creaking floors, and the smell of pine mixed with old wood, had stayed with me. I decided that this year, in late October of 2012, I would finally go back alone for a week. The drive up there was long, almost 7 hours from Boston. I took a rented Subaru, loaded with camping gear, a small generator, and enough food to last 10 days. The further north I drove, the colder it got. By the time I reached the last stretch of the dirt road, a thick fog had begun to settle in the forest. The trees on either side of the narrow road were like dark sentinels, stretching high above, their branches interlaced. The air smelled damp, earthy, and bitterly cold. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, feeling the car's tires crunch over the frost-covered dirt. When I finally saw the cabin, I almost didn't recognize it. The paint was long gone, leaving behind gray, splintered wood. Some of the boards were warped from rain, and the roof had several missing shingles. A thin plume of smoke curled lazily from the old stone chimney, which I hadn't lit. My uncle must have left it years ago. I parked the car on the side, grabbed my bag, and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The inside smelled musty, like wet leaves mixed with the faint odor of old firewood. Dust floated in the shafts of light coming through the grimy windows. The cabin was small, with one main room that combined kitchen and living area, a narrow hallway that led to a tiny bedroom, and a bathroom that hadn't been used in years. I set up my sleeping bag in the bedroom and unpacked my supplies. It was quiet in a way I hadn't realized I missed, the kind of quiet where every creak, every rustle of the trees seems amplified. Outside, the wind shook the branches, making them scrape against each other like dry bones. That first night, I made a small fire in the stove and cooked some soup. I could hear the occasional thump or snap from the forest, probably a deer or a raccoon. But there were moments when the noises stopped altogether, and the silence became almost oppressive. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. My heart rate jumped immediately. I was alone, or so I thought, but the steps were slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the back door. I grabbed the baseball bat I had brought for safety and pressed myself against the wall near the door. I strained my ears. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard the soft scrape of something metal against wood. Someone had tried the back door. My mind raced. Who would be out here, miles from the nearest road? The forest seemed endless. I stayed still for what felt like hours, gripping the bat and listening. Eventually, the sounds faded. I never saw anyone, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I went outside to inspect. The frost on the ground had been disturbed. Footprints led from the edge of the tree line to the back of the cabin. I knelt down and studied them. They were human, size and shape like a man's boots, but fresh, no older than a few hours. My stomach sank. I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There was no one in sight. I realized then how exposed I was. I was completely isolated, with no phone signal, no neighbors, no one to help if something went wrong. I decided to stay calm, rational. I reinforced the locks on the doors and double-checked my windows. I also moved the generator closer to the cabin so that it would be easier to hear anything moving outside. That day, I tried to focus on normal things, collecting firewood, cooking, cleaning, but every small noise kept me on edge. By nightfall, the forest felt alive in a way I didn't like. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and shadows moved across the perimeter of the cabin. I kept the fire in the stove going all night, the light spilling into the darkness. I didn't sleep much. On the third day, I noticed something worse. One of the windows in the living area had been opened slightly. I was certain I had locked it. Nothing inside the cabin had been disturbed, but the window was ajar. The realization that someone had been inside without me knowing sent a cold wave down my spine. I took inventory of everything valuable, my laptop, my camera, some cash, and hid them in the bedroom closet. I also hung my coat and backpack in front of the door, just to make it obvious that someone would have to move them to get inside. By the fourth day, my anxiety had escalated. Every time I went outside to check on firewood or water, I felt like I was being watched. I carried the baseball bat everywhere and began keeping small rocks in my pockets to throw if needed. The forest seemed endless and impenetrable. The silence was deafening, yet every small sound made me tense. That night, I heard a low, scraping sound near the window again, and then a muffled thump. I could no longer ignore the fact that someone had followed me here. I knew I had to act. On the fifth day, I left early in the morning and started walking the dirt road toward the main highway. I took only my phone, hoping for a signal, and the backpack with my essentials. It was slow going, thick frost, fallen branches, and uneven terrain, but after 3 hours, I finally had a weak signal. I called the local police and reported everything. They asked me for details, and I gave them every description I could. The footprints, the open window, the strange sounds. Patrol promised to check the area. When they arrived later that afternoon, the officers found evidence that confirmed my fears. There had been someone living in the woods nearby. They had set up a crude hideout less than half a mile from the cabin and had clearly been watching the cabin for days. They hadn't taken anything yet, but the officers said it was likely they were waiting for someone to be alone for long enough to make a move. They were gone by the time the police searched the area, but it explained the footprints, the window, and the noises I had heard at night. I left the cabin that day and didn't look back. Driving back to Boston, the relief I felt was overwhelming. I realized how much I had underestimated the risks of isolation. It wasn't the woods themselves that were scary. It was the vulnerability, the knowledge that a stranger could be watching and waiting without me knowing. In the following weeks, I made sure to change my routines, install better locks at home, and even took a self-defense class. Even now, years later, I still remember the cabin. The smell of damp pine, the creaking wood, the fog settling around the trees at dusk. I never returned, and I never will. But the experience left me with a deeper awareness of how thin the line can be between solitude and danger. Sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural, they're very human and very real. I never planned to spend a night alone on that farm, but in late autumn of 2016, I found myself driving through the flat fields of northern Missouri with the sun slipping down behind the tree line. I had taken a week off from work, hoping to clear my head after a rough few months. My cousin had offered me the old farm cabin he used to rent out for hunters. He said it was quiet, isolated, nothing around for miles. I didn't think much of it. I thought silence was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the long dirt driveway, the sky had turned a dull orange that faded into pale gray. The air felt colder out there than it did in town, and the wind pushed thin streams of dust across the road. My tires crushed dried corn stalks that had blown loose from the harvested fields. It felt like driving into a place that had been forgotten for years. The cabin sat near the far edge of the property, right beside an old barn with rusted roof panels that curled upward at the edges. Faded red paint clung to the planks in uneven patches. The cabin itself was small and plain, built from weathered wood that had grown gray from sun and rain. The front steps sagged in the middle, and the screen door hung slightly crooked. I felt a strange heaviness settle into me as soon as I stepped out of the car and smelled the dry, cold air. It wasn't fear, just an awareness that I was far from anyone, far from anything familiar. Inside, the cabin had a simple layout. One bedroom, a small kitchen with old appliances, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of damp wood. The floorboards creaked in a tired way beneath my boots. Dust floated in the last streaks of orange light coming through the small windows. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle into the place, trying to convince myself I would get used to the silence. What I didn't expect was how loud silence could feel when the world outside went completely still. By the time darkness spread fully across the land, the temperature had dropped sharply. The wind had stopped. The air felt thick, like everything around me was holding its breath. I sat on the small wooden chair near the kitchen window, eating a simple meal, listening to nothing but the faint hum of the old refrigerator. The cabin felt like a shell sitting at the edge of a giant, empty field. Every creak, every soft thump from the settling wood felt too sharp, too close. As the hours passed, a growing sense of unease settled into my stomach. I tried to tell myself it was only because I wasn't used to being so isolated. But something felt off outside. When I glanced out the windows, the fields looked darker than they should have. The barn beside the cabin looked like a massive shadow leaning over the earth. I tried to sleep around 11. The bedroom was small, cold, and smelled faintly of old soil and dried grass, as if the place had soaked up the scent of decades of farm work. I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint groans of the cabin expanding and contracting with the temperature. Somewhere near midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a small, steady sound, almost like soft steps moving across the dry dirt or gravel. I froze. My breath became shallow. The sound came and went, then returned again with a slow, irregular rhythm. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal scurrying quickly like a raccoon or rabbit. It was heavier, slower, like a person carefully placing their feet one at a time. I stayed completely still, staring into the darkness. I waited for the steps to fade, but they didn't. They shifted to the side of the cabin, then paused again. The long silence that followed felt worse than the sound itself. My skin prickled. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. When the steps finally stopped, I waited for several minutes before trying to convince myself it had just been an animal. But deep inside, I knew the weight of those steps wasn't from an animal. They carried intention. I tried to sleep again, but my mind wouldn't let me. I lay there until around 2 in the morning before sitting up, breathing slowly, and deciding I needed to look outside. Part of me wanted to ignore everything and stay under the covers, but another part knew I wouldn't rest until I checked. I stepped quietly to the window and lifted one corner of the curtain. The yard was dark, with only a faint bit of moonlight reflecting off the roof of the barn. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The dirt driveway was empty. The field beyond the cabin was a flat shadow. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the night, I saw something near the barn. A shape. It stood beside the open barn door, almost blending into the dark wall. I couldn't make out its face, but I could see its posture. A tall, thin figure standing completely still, like it was watching the cabin. Nothing moved. The air outside felt dead. My fingers tightened on the window frame. A cold tremor crawled up my spine. I didn't know if it had seen me. I stepped back slowly, careful not to let the floor creak. I pressed my back to the wall and stared at the faint outline of the window. My thoughts ran in circles, my chest tightening with each passing second. I didn't want to stay, but the idea of stepping outside was worse. The roads were pitch black, unlit, and I didn't know how long that figure had been out there or if there were others. I stayed in the bedroom until the faintest light of dawn brushed the sky. Only when the darkness finally thinned did I feel like I could move without something watching me. Morning light made everything look almost normal. The barn looked like a worn-out structure again. The field looked calm, but the ground near the barn door was disturbed, like someone had walked back and forth repeatedly. The dust and dirt had fresh prints, edges still crisp. They weren't animal prints. I packed my bag as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. My hands shook as I carried my things to the car. The cold morning air felt sharp against my skin. The wind had returned, brushing the tall grass in long, soft waves. It almost gave the illusion of peace, but I didn't trust it. Before I got into the car, I looked once more toward the barn. The door was slightly more open than the night before, as if someone had pushed it gently. A long shadow stretched from it across the dry ground. I knew someone had been out there watching the cabin for reasons I didn't want to understand. I left the farm without looking back again. The tires skidded slightly on the soft dirt at the start of the driveway, and I kept my foot steady on the gas the whole way out to the road. For the rest of the day, my mind replayed that dark shape standing by the barn, the slow steps around the cabin, the quiet tension that hung in the air like something waiting for the right moment. 2 weeks later, my cousin called me to ask how the trip had gone. I didn't tell him the whole truth. I told him the place just felt too isolated for me. He didn't push it, but then he mentioned something I couldn't forget. He told me the cabin had been broken into twice earlier that year. Nothing had been stolen, nothing damaged, but someone had clearly been inside. The police had never found who it was. I knew someone was still out there on that land. Someone who watched the cabin at night. Someone who moved slowly, deliberately, like they were studying whoever stayed inside. I still think about that night sometimes, about the silence, the cold air, the dark figure leaning near the barn. I haven't gone back since, and I won't. The ending was clear the moment I drove away that morning. The cabin wasn't empty. The farm wasn't abandoned. Someone was waiting out there in the dark, and I was lucky enough to leave before I found out what they wanted. I left with the understanding that some places should stay empty, and some quiet isn't peaceful. It's a warning. And I don't plan to ignore that warning ever again. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small rental cabin deep in the mountains of northern Colorado. It was the autumn of 2016, the kind of season where the air felt thin and sharp, and every breath tasted like dry leaves. I had been working long hours for months, and the idea of isolation felt like the only thing that might reset my mind. The cabin sat almost 3 miles off the main gravel road, hidden by tall pines and rough slopes of stone. It wasn't big, just one room with a small sleeping loft, a wood stove, and a narrow deck that faced a hollow full of twisted trees. I arrived late in the afternoon, just when the sky started to dim. The sun dipped behind the ridge so fast that the temperature fell in a single slow breath. By the time I carried my last bag inside, the woods were already dark. No other houses were anywhere near me. Even the nearest ranger station was almost an hour away. That isolation was supposed to feel peaceful, but something about the silence there pressed against me in a way I didn't expect. It was too thick, too heavy, like it was holding its breath. The first night passed quietly. I unpacked, stacked firewood, heated a small pot of canned soup, and listened to the stove crackle until the room felt warm. I lay in the loft listening to the wind scrape against the cabin walls. It was the kind of sound that would normally put me to sleep, but I stayed awake longer than I wanted, staring at the ceiling beams and wondering why the night felt so alert, as if something outside was paying attention. On the second day, I walked the slope behind the cabin, trying to follow a narrow trail the owner mentioned in his email. The ground there was uneven, scattered with fallen branches and old pine needles soft enough to swallow footsteps. Halfway up the slope, I found tracks in the dirt, long, wide, and spaced in a way that didn't match anything I could identify. They were too long to be deer and too narrow to be bear. My first thought was that they were just distorted by erosion or rain from the week before. Still, I kept staring at them longer than I should have, as if my mind wanted to fit them into a shape that didn't belong to any animal I knew. By the afternoon, a fog settled low across the hollow, creeping between the tree trunks like smoke. I went back inside early, more because of the strange atmosphere than the weather. I tried to read, but I kept glancing toward the small window beside the bed. The fog was so thick that it erased everything beyond a few feet. It felt like the world had shrunk down to only the inside of the cabin, and something about that made me restless. That night, I heard the first sound. It was long after midnight, sometime when the fire had burned low and only faint orange light flickered through the room. I woke up without knowing why, just a sudden jolt as if my body sensed something before my mind did. Then I heard it, a soft dragging noise outside, slow and uneven. It moved along the side of the cabin, brushing the outer wall with a faint scrape. For several minutes it circled, stopping for long, silent stretches before continuing again. I lay perfectly still, not even breathing fully, listening to it move around me in the dark. It wasn't an animal shifting its weight or chewing something. It was something studying the structure of the cabin itself, moving deliberately from wall to wall. Eventually, the sound faded into the woods. I stayed awake until sunrise. On the morning of the third day, I walked the perimeter of the cabin looking for any sign of what I heard. The ground was soft from the nighttime frost melting, and I could clearly see prints, fresh, deep, and human. But the steps didn't form a normal walking pattern. They were too spread out in some areas, too close in others, as if someone had been changing their stride length on purpose. The strange part was the track size itself. Some prints looked large, almost like a man with long feet, while others were much smaller, like a teenager's. But the spacing suggested it was one person switching between them. That made no sense to me, and the more I studied the ground, the more wrong it all felt. I spent the rest of the day inside. Every hour I checked the windows. Every movement in the trees made my heart pound. The silence didn't help. It was so quiet that even the stove crackling felt loud enough to give away my position. Near dusk, I heard something again, this time from farther away. It was a single thump, like a foot hitting a hollow log. Then another, slow, steady, spaced just far enough apart to match walking. I didn't want to look outside, but my body moved on its own. When I pulled the curtain back just an inch, I saw a shape standing between two trees. First, I thought it was a person. The outline was tall and thin, facing the cabin. But something was off about the posture. The figure stood too straight, like someone holding themselves in an unnatural pose. I stared for what felt like minutes, trying to make sense of it, until the figure slowly stepped backward into the fog and disappeared. That night was worse than the one before. I heard movement again, but this time there were short bursts of rustling, like someone was pacing or crawling on the ground. Then came a sound that made my stomach clench, a perfect copy of my own footsteps from earlier in the day, hitting the exact same spots around the cabin. I knew because the pattern was too specific, too measured. It was like someone replaying the memory of my walk, step by step. No conversation. No voice, just imitation. By the fourth morning, I was planning to leave. I packed my bags, loaded my car, and was ready to go. But before leaving, I walked to the edge of the hollow one last time, trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining everything. That was when I saw something caught on a branch. A strip of fabric, dark and rough, torn from clothing. It looked like old denim. Next to it, pressed into the mud, was a deep print that looked like a bare foot, long and wide, but the heel impression was sharp, almost square-edged, like someone had been forcing their weight unnaturally. Something wasn't living out there. Something was hiding. I didn't stay another minute. The drive back down the narrow road felt endless. Every tree looked like it was watching me leave. When I reached the main gravel road and finally saw the highway in the distance, my chest loosened for the first time in days. I reported everything to the owner once I reached town. He told me that strange things had happened in those woods for years, mostly trespassers, hunters, or people living off-grid who moved around at night to avoid being seen. Some of them were known to mimic voices or copy footsteps to scare campers. He said one man had been arrested 2 years earlier for stalking hikers, crawling on all fours to imitate animals, and wearing different pieces of clothing to change his appearance. Local people had been calling him a skinwalker, not because of supernatural reasons, but because he would use animal hides, masks, and odd movements to confuse those who saw him. That explanation should have calmed me, but honestly it made everything worse. Knowing it was a real person, someone who lived in those woods, someone who walked around cabins at night imitating the people staying inside, made the whole experience 10 times more disturbing than any legend. I never went back to that cabin. I never even drove through that region again. Even now, when I think about those nights, what bothers me the most isn't the tracks or the figure in the fog. It's the memory of hearing my own footsteps outside the cabin walls, perfectly copied, like someone trying to learn how to move like me. It reminded me that the most frightening things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're people who try to erase the line between themselves and someone else, people who watch in silence, waiting for the exact moment when the person inside the cabin forgets they're not alone. And the worst part, the part that still wakes me some nights, is knowing that whoever was out there didn't try to break in. They didn't rush the cabin or try to scare me openly. They were studying me, and studying someone means planning for something later. I left before they could finish whatever they were preparing. It was the fall of 2009 when I decided to take a week off from work and disappear into the mountains of northern Idaho. I had spent months staring at spreadsheets, emails, and office lights that buzzed like angry insects. The idea of a week alone in a remote hunting cabin, far from cell towers and cars, sounded like salvation. I was 29 at the time, fit, experienced in the outdoors, but also cautious enough to know that the wilderness didn't forgive mistakes. I drove my old truck up the winding dirt roads, past golden aspen groves and towering pines, the tires crunching over gravel. By late afternoon, I reached the cabin, a small, weathered log structure tucked against a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. I had rented it from a local family who still used it for hunting trips. The cabin smelled of old wood and faint mildew. Inside, a cast iron stove sat in the corner, a stack of firewood neatly piled beside it, and the furniture was sparse. 2 chairs, a table, a small cot with a rough blanket, and a shelf of dusty hunting books. The first night, I settled in early, lighting a fire that crackled in the stove. The wind outside rattled the shutters, and shadows from the flames danced along the rough walls. I unpacked my gear, rifle, ammunition, a hatchet, flashlight, and survival supplies. I checked the locks on the cabin door and the small window, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. Even though the cabin was isolated, the quiet felt too heavy, almost like it was pressing down on me. The next morning, I went out to check the perimeter and scout for deer. The forest was thick with pine needles and wet leaves. Every step I took, I felt the damp crunch beneath my boots, the scent of pine resin mixing with the musk of the forest floor. Birds called to each other, and occasionally I would hear a distant snap of a branch, but nothing seemed close enough to worry about. By mid-morning, I spotted some deer tracks near a small stream and decided to set up a stand for later. That night, as I returned to the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the mountains, and darkness swallowed the valley. The forest was alive with the sounds of night, owls, rustling leaves, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. I cooked a simple meal over the stove and tried to read, but the firelight was uneven, casting long shadows that made the room feel smaller and more confined. I eventually went to bed, leaving the rifle close by, and slept lightly, waking several times to creaks and groans of the cabin settling. The following days were routine. I hunted during the day, kept the fire going at night, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But then I noticed something strange. On the third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a soft noise outside, a rhythmic crunching sound, like someone stepping carefully over twigs. At first, I told myself it was an animal. The forest was full of them, but the sound seemed deliberate enough to make my stomach knot. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears. The crunching stopped, and the wind carried no scent, no sound of an animal running away. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. The deer tracks I had seen earlier were now scattered in a pattern that didn't make sense. Footprints that didn't match any deer or elk, small and human-like, circling the cabin in a way that suggested someone had been watching me. My mind raced. Could someone be out there, watching me all this time? It didn't make sense. The cabin was isolated, and the nearest road was miles away. Over the next 2 nights, the feeling of being watched intensified. I started hearing more noises, soft scratching on the cabin walls, the occasional bump against the wooden door, faint footsteps outside. I didn't sleep more than a few hours at a stretch. On the 5th night, I decided to stay fully awake, sitting in a chair near the door with my rifle across my lap, my flashlight on the floor casting long shadows. At about 1:30 a.m., I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. My pulse quickened. I slowly crept to the window and peeked out. The moon was thin, casting silver light over the forest floor. At first, I saw nothing, then a movement. Someone crouched in the shadows near the tree line, barely visible. My heart thumped. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide entirely, just watching, waiting. I gripped the rifle tighter, my fingers cold and trembling. Hours passed like that. The figure never came closer, never revealed themselves fully. By dawn, they were gone, but the footprints remained, some almost on the edge of the clearing around the cabin. I felt a mix of terror and relief. It wasn't a ghost or some mythical creature. It was a human being, and humans could be dangerous, unpredictable. I packed my gear that morning, deciding to leave immediately. As I loaded my truck, I noticed something else. More footprints leading into the woods, away from the cabin, small and deliberate, moving toward the ridge behind me. Whoever had been watching me was no longer just an observer. They had been waiting, studying, and now they had retreated, but they knew I was aware. I drove off slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror at the cabin. The figure of a man, perhaps, standing at the treeline, watching me leave. I didn't return to that cabin for years. I told no one at the time, partly out of embarrassment, partly because I didn't want anyone else to go through it. But the experience stayed with me. I realized that the wilderness is not only home to animals and quiet beauty. It can also harbor people who are willing to exploit solitude for their own purposes. Eventually, I contacted the family who owned the cabin. They were shocked when I told them about the footprints and the figure. They mentioned rumors of poachers in that area, people who would watch remote hunters and campers to steal game or supplies. The more I thought about it, the more I understood why I had felt so unsafe. It wasn't imagination. It was real, and I had narrowly avoided a confrontation that could have ended badly. Years later, I still drive through that region, but I stick to populated areas or go with friends. The mountains are beautiful, but I learned that solitude can be dangerous in ways I hadn't expected. That week in the cabin taught me to respect not only nature, but also the unpredictability of people who may be hiding, watching, and waiting just beyond your vision. I never saw the man again, but I sometimes wonder who he was, why he chose that cabin, and whether he is still out there, waiting for someone else to arrive, thinking no one is watching. That week changed me. I learned to trust my instincts, to observe carefully, and to never underestimate how close danger can be, even when you feel utterly alone in the wilderness. Even now, I can remember the sound of those footsteps, precise and deliberate, circling the cabin in the dark, and the cold realization that solitude in the wild is never absolute. It was the winter of 2011 when I decided to take a break from my flat in Manchester. I had been working in IT for almost 6 years by then, and the monotony of office life had worn me down. I found a listing online for a small cabin in the Scottish Highlands, near a tiny village called Kinloch Rannoch. The photographs were rustic, almost bare, but there was something about the isolation that drew me in. I wanted quiet, and I certainly wasn't expecting company. I rented the place for a week in late November. Driving up, the roads became narrower and more winding, bordered by tall, leafless trees that scratched the sky with their bare branches. The air smelled of wet soil and with smoke from chimneys I could see in the distance. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. The cabin itself was small, perhaps only 3 rooms. It had a rough stone exterior and a wooden roof with patches of moss creeping along the edges. Inside, the smell of damp would hit me immediately, along with a faint mildew that seemed to cling to the corners. The furniture was minimal: an old couch with faded cushions, a wooden table scarred with knife marks, a small stove that still had a pile of ash in it. Dust covered every surface, and there were no signs of anyone having stayed there recently. It felt abandoned, yet oddly preserved. That first night, I kept the fire going and tried to read, but sleep didn't come easily. There was a persistent creaking sound outside the cabin, the wind pushing against the roof, branches scraping along the walls. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside, but when I looked through the grimy window, nothing was there. I chalked it up to imagination. This was the Highlands, after all, and it was easy to think you heard things in the cold, empty woods. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I followed a narrow path through the trees that led to a small frozen stream. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, desolate way: gray skies, brown grass poking through the snow, the distant mountains rising like shadowed walls. As I walked, I noticed something unusual. About 200 meters from the cabin, on a small slope leading into the forest, There were signs of a campfire that had been used recently. Ashes were still black and warm to the touch, and a few pieces of firewood had been split clumsily. I felt a twinge of unease but brushed it off. People lived in these woods. It wasn't that strange. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I noticed something on the windowsill, small scratches, as though someone had been peering in. My stomach sank, but I still tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal? A curious fox or badger? That night was worse than the first. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and making the cabin feel smaller and colder. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of soft tapping against the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the tapping was deliberate, measured, slow. My heart was pounding. I got up cautiously and peered through the peephole. I could see nothing in the blackness, just the faint outline of snow falling. I waited, holding my breath, until the sound stopped. Sleep didn't come back. Instead, I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, imagining what might be outside. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch, but it was impossible to tell if it was real or my imagination running wild. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin. I packed quickly, thinking maybe I had let my mind get the better of me. As I was about to walk to my car, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I froze. She wasn't moving like someone who had just appeared by accident. She was perfectly still, almost blending into the shadows, but I could see her face, or rather, the shape of her face. It was gaunt, pale, framed by long, stringy hair that looked wet and unkempt. Her clothes were dark, tattered, like she had been living in the woods for years. She didn't make a sound, didn't move toward me, just stared. Her eyes caught mine for a brief moment, and I swear there was a cold, calculating look in them. My first instinct was to run, but I reminded myself I was in open space. I had to be careful, not just run blindly into the forest. I slowly reached my car and got in, keeping my eyes on her. By the time I started the engine, she was gone. No sign of her, no footprints in the fresh snow, nothing. I drove away without looking back, my heart hammering, hands shaking. But that wasn't the end. When I returned home to Manchester, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I had nightmares about her watching me through the trees, following me through the woods. I couldn't explain it, not logically. She had appeared and disappeared without a trace. Months later, I found an article online about a missing woman in the Highlands. She had been reported missing around the same time I stayed at the cabin. The description matched her almost exactly. Long dark hair, pale skin, gaunt features. Local authorities speculated she had been living in the woods, away from society, for months before she disappeared completely. No trace of her body was ever found. I never returned to the Highlands, but for years after, whenever I saw isolated woods or old cabins in rural areas, I remembered her. I realized that what I had seen was not supernatural, not a ghost. She was real, human, probably desperate or dangerous, and I had been lucky she hadn't moved toward me. The thought that she might have been watching others in the area silently was terrifying. It made the beauty of the Highlands seem cold and hostile. Eventually, I told myself it was time to stop thinking about it, to leave it in the past. But even now, over a decade later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night and hear footsteps in the hallways of my flat, quiet, deliberate, almost like hers. I know it's my mind playing tricks on me, yet deep down, I know that somewhere out there, in the woods of Scotland, she might still be out there, watching, moving silently through the snow, perfectly still, waiting for no one in particular, and that thought makes the hairs on my neck stand on end every single time. It was the summer of 1998, and I had been a park ranger in the Northern Rockies for about 4 years by then. I was 26, a bit younger than some of the older rangers, but I had learned to move through the wilderness quietly, to notice what others overlooked. My shift was the evening to early morning rotation, which I liked because the forest at night had a rhythm that the day never did. On this particular July evening, I was stationed at a small ranger cabin near Eagle Creek, a little-known tributary tucked between high ridges and dense fir forests. The cabin was one of those old government-built structures, boxy and simple, with weathered cedar siding and a rusting metal roof. The wood smelled faintly of pine sap, even inside. A small stove dominated the corner, a cast-iron relic that needed constant attention in cooler months, though in summer it mostly gathered dust. The windows were old, slightly warped, letting in slivers of fading sunlight and giving the forest outside a fractured, almost dreamlike quality. I had arrived just before dusk. The drive up the narrow, gravel road had been uneventful. The only sounds the tires crunching on stones and the occasional bird calling from deep in the trees. I pulled up near the cabin, unloaded my pack, and immediately noticed the silence around me. Not the calm, peaceful kind you sometimes feel in the mountains, but the heavy, expectant kind. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. Inside, I lit a small lantern and began checking my supplies. I always kept extra flares, a first aid kit, maps, and my radio on hand. I had a small cot pushed against the wall, a simple folding chair, and a table that served as my work surface. On top of it, I spread out maps of the surrounding trails, marking areas where hikers had reported wildlife sightings or minor injuries. Everything seemed normal, routine even. I reminded myself that I had handled countless nights alone in the forest and that there was nothing unusual about the stillness. By 10 p.m., the sky had turned inky black, and the forest beyond the windows seemed almost solid, like a wall of black and green. I had eaten a small dinner, canned beans warmed over the stove, and had settled in with a book, though I wasn't really reading. My ears picked up every tiny sound, the creak of the cabin as it settled, the scratch of a branch against the roof, the distant gurgle of the creek. It was just past midnight when I first noticed it. A sound, low and deliberate, coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some larger mammal moving through the brush. But then it repeated, a faint crunching of boots, or so it sounded, against the gravel path leading up to the cabin. My stomach tightened. I didn't own a firearm. Regulations in the park didn't allow for it inside ranger stations. Though I kept a heavy-duty flashlight and bear spray at the ready, I switched off the lantern and peered through the window. The forest was dark, the kind of darkness where shapes dissolve into shadows. I strained my eyes, watching the gravel road that led to the cabin. There was nothing there, just my own breath, fogging slightly against the glass. The sound came again, closer this time, deliberate. Someone or something was moving toward the cabin. My pulse quickened, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I crept to the side door, keeping to the shadows, and grabbed the flashlight. I cracked the door just enough to see outside. The beam swept across the clearing in front of the cabin. Empty. No footprints, no movement, just the faint rustle of leaves. And yet, I knew I had heard someone or something walking. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the echo in my head. I spent the next hour checking every window, every corner of the cabin, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But then came the noise at the back door, a soft but distinct knocking, not like someone testing the door politely, but deliberate, almost trying to be heard. I didn't answer. I didn't move. My hand rested on the edge of the table, trembling slightly. I considered calling for backup over the radio, but the signal in that part of the forest was patchy at best. The last thing I wanted was to announce my exact location if someone was actually out there with bad intentions. So I stayed put, listening, waiting. The knocking stopped, The silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind through the trees, made me flinch. By 4 a.m., the eastern sky began to lighten, a pale wash of gray that slowly turned to gold. I had the cabin locked down tight, every latch secured, and my flashlight clutched in my hands. When the first rays of sunlight hit the clearing, I finally dared to look outside again. The gravel path was pristine, undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of movement. I packed my bag, preparing to leave. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. A line of small stones, deliberately placed from the edge of the forest toward the cabin door. Someone had been there. They hadn't touched the cabin itself, hadn't tried to force entry, but they had left a trail, almost as if marking the path to the cabin. My stomach sank. Whoever it was, they had been careful, patient, observing. I decided to hike back down to the ranger station at the main road, leaving the cabin behind. The walk took longer than usual. Every sound made me jump. But the forest, in the daylight, seemed less menacing, more ordinary. When I finally arrived at the station, I reported the incident to the senior ranger. They were concerned but skeptical. This sort of thing happened rarely, vandalism, trespassing, but nothing violent, nothing dangerous, at least nothing before. Later that day, a ranger team went back up to the cabin. They found the same line of stones. No footprints. No sign of anyone lingering. The cabin itself was untouched, everything in place. It was as if whoever had been there had vanished into thin air. The forest, for all its vastness, held on to secrets, and that night had been a stark reminder. In the following weeks, I returned a few times to Eagle Creek Cabin, never alone. Each time, the silence seemed to stretch, heavy with the unspoken presence of someone who had been there. But nothing else happened. No one was ever caught, no footprints, no clues, nothing to indicate what or who had come to the cabin that night. I eventually left the Park Service and moved to another state, away from the forests I had once known so well. But I still remember that night vividly. The thick darkness pressing against the windows, the sound of deliberate steps in the night, and the line of stones leading up to a cabin that should have been safe. The forest had shown me that even in familiar places, there were mysteries that could not be solved, and some encounters were meant to be remembered, not explained. That cabin still stands, old cedar walls weathered by years of wind and rain, untouched except by time. And I know, deep down, that whatever was there that night might still be watching, patient and silent, waiting for the next person to enter its quiet domain. I still remember that night in the late autumn of 2012, one of those nights when the rain doesn't just fall, it drives into everything, soaking the earth, the trees, and anyone caught outside. I was 28 at the time, alone, trying to finish building a small cabin I had been working on for months in the remote hills of northern Vermont. The place was nearly a 3-hour drive from the nearest town, and the road had all but disappeared into mud and puddles the size of small ponds. By the time I pulled my old Jeep onto the narrow trail that led to my site, the storm had picked up. The headlights reflected off sheets of water sliding down the dirt path, and the air smelled of wet pine and cold soil. I could feel the chill through the layers of my jacket, even though I had worn 3. The cabin itself was modest, a one-room structure I had framed with cedar beams I milled myself. I wanted it small, manageable, something that could withstand a rough winter if I had to spend a few nights there. The walls were halfway up, the roof was only partially covered, and the small porch jutted out awkwardly over the sloping ground. Everything was exposed. I parked the Jeep under the sparse cover of a few tall maples, slamming the doors against the wind and the rain, and trudged toward the cabin carrying a backpack with my tools, nails, a hammer, a small saw, and a thermos of hot coffee. As I stepped onto the porch boards, slick with rain, the first thing I noticed was the sound. The wind howled through the unfinished gables, and the rain hammered the roof in a sharp, staccato rhythm. Every board groaned under the weight of water and my boots. I had always liked the sound of a storm when I was properly sheltered, but this was different. I could hear the creek below the hill swelling, rushing in furious currents, and every so often, the wind would blow through a partially nailed plank and let in a burst of icy air. My hands were already damp and cold from the rain dripping off the hood of my jacket, but I forced myself to start work. I had intended to finish the roof before the night fell completely, and I knew I didn't have much time. The sky was an angry gray that seemed to darken every few minutes, and by the time I hauled up the last sheet of plywood, the rain was almost horizontal. Each nail I hammered in was a struggle. The boards slipped under my wet hands, and my gloves offered little grip. I was soaked, shivering, but I pressed on, knowing that even a partially covered roof was better than nothing if the storm got worse. At one point, as I was balancing on a beam to secure a corner, I heard a strange cracking sound. My heart jumped. I froze and listened. It wasn't thunder, not exactly. It was sharp, like a branch snapping under weight. I thought maybe it was one of the older trees at the edge of the clearing giving way. I set my tools down carefully and peered into the storm, trying to make out anything in the near dark. Visibility was almost zero. Everything was a blur of rain and shadows. The noise came again, closer this time. I realized then that it wasn't the trees. Someone or something was moving through the underbrush near the edge of my small clearing. I felt a surge of fear, the kind that makes your stomach tighten and your hands shake. My brain raced with every rational explanation. An animal, maybe a deer, a bear, even pushed into the storm. But there was something off. The steps were uneven, deliberate. I debated leaving, climbing down the hill to the jeep, but I knew the ground was slick. One misstep and I could break an ankle, or worse, be stranded in this storm with nowhere to go. I swallowed hard, gripped my hammer, and decided to finish the roof as fast as I could. By the time I nailed down the last loose sheet and slid down the ladder, I was soaked through, my jeans heavy with water, my jacket dripping onto the rough boards. I grabbed the small propane lantern I had brought and lit it. Its warm yellow light flickered against the wet walls and floor, casting long shadows that seemed to move in rhythm with the trees outside. I finally let myself sit down on one of the floor joists, exhausted, heart still hammering. The strange noises had stopped, replaced by the roaring of the wind and the relentless rain. I spent the next hour checking every corner, every plank. The walls were solid, the roof at least held together for now, and the porch, slick as it was, didn't creak in a way that worried me. The cabin felt small but safe, like a fragile little bubble against the storm. My fingers were numb by the time I reached for the thermos and poured myself a steaming cup of coffee. I sipped it slowly, savoring the heat and letting it spread through my chest. Eventually, the exhaustion from cold, fear, and adrenaline overtook me. I set the lantern on the floor and crawled into the sleeping bag I had brought, pulling it tight around my shoulders. I listened to the storm for what felt like hours. The wind battered the roof, rain hammered the boards, and the creek roared like a beast below. I felt the tension in my shoulders slowly ease. Somewhere around midnight, I realized the noises outside, the cracking, the shuffling, hadn't returned. Whatever had been there had either left or found shelter elsewhere. I woke the next morning to a sky still heavy with clouds, but the rain reduced to a drizzle. The storm had left its mark. The small clearing was muddy, leaves and broken branches scattered across the ground, and water pooled in shallow depressions. I climbed out of the sleeping bag and inspected the cabin in daylight. Nothing was broken, the roof held up, and the walls had shed the worst of the water. I took a deep breath of cold, wet air, and for the first time, really looked at the place I had built. It wasn't much, a single room with a makeshift roof and rough cedar walls, but it was mine. I realized, standing there with my hands on my hips and my boots sinking slightly into the mud, that I had faced the storm and come through it. I had built something real with my own hands, in the middle of a place that didn't forgive mistakes. The fear I felt the night before had been sharp and sudden, but it was gone now, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and clarity. Over the next few weeks, I finished the cabin properly. I added insulation, reinforced the porch, and installed a small wood stove that would keep the place warm in winter. Each nail and beam reminded me of that night, the rain slamming down, the wind screaming through the trees, and the sound of movement I could neither see nor identify. I never saw whatever it was again, but I never forgot the adrenaline, the isolation, and the raw feeling of being utterly exposed to the elements. Years later, I still think about that night whenever I see a storm. The fear, the rawness of being alone in a storm with nothing but your own skill and grit to protect you, taught me something I carry to this day. Preparation, persistence, and respect for nature matter more than luck. The cabin still stands, nearly a decade later, and I often visit it to remind myself that even in the worst weather, and even when you feel completely alone, you can make something that lasts. Something real. I never meant to go back there, not really. The idea of it had been gnawing at me for months, an uneasy curiosity mixed with some dumb sense of responsibility. It was early October of 2011 when I found myself driving down a rough, narrow dirt road in northern Vermont, a place I hadn't been in over a decade. The trees were starting to bleed color, reds, golds, oranges, and the sun was low, casting long shadows that made the forest look deeper and darker than it really was. I was passing the town of Rutland, trying to follow directions that I'd printed from some outdated GPS site, when I realized I had no real plan beyond get to the cabin. The cabin belonged to my ex-wife's older sister, Madeline. I hadn't seen her in years either, and truthfully, I hadn't been particularly close with her even back then. But when I inherited some of her old mail by accident, she'd mentioned something about the cabin needing a check-in, about some overdue repairs that had been left to rot. I told myself I was just doing a favor, but deep down I knew it was also about curiosity. A weird, uncomfortable pull to see the place one last time before it completely disappeared into the forest. The road ended abruptly at a steep incline. I had to park my old Subaru at the base of a hill and walk the rest of the way, dragging a backpack full of tools, canned food, and a small first aid kit. The path was narrow, barely maintained, and the leaves were slippery with dew. My boots crunched and slipped in a rhythm that somehow made me feel like I was intruding on something sacred and forgotten. The cabin appeared suddenly, like it had been swallowed by the forest and spat out in one crooked, grim line of timber. It was old, older than I'd expected. The wood was gray and weathered, warped in places by water damage, and some of the shingles on the roof had already fallen, leaving dark, gaping holes. I noticed the windows immediately. One of them was cracked across the middle, spider webbing out from the center. There was no smoke from a chimney, no signs of life, just the forest pressing in on all sides, a kind of quiet that made my skin prickle. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mold. I set down my backpack and ran a hand along the edge of a table that had clearly been here for decades. There were signs that someone had been here recently. Footprints in the dirt by the entrance, a coffee mug on the counter with a faint ring of dried liquid, a newspaper folded on a chair with the edges curled for moisture. Whoever had been here hadn't been living in it, not really, but they had been present. That detail made me uneasy, more than the smell or the state of decay. I spent the first hour walking through the rooms, checking the foundation, the walls, and the roof. Most of the furniture was broken or splintered, but some of it seemed to hold, like it had resisted time better than the rest. I noticed a locked door at the back of the cabin. The kind of door that looks ordinary but somehow radiates secrecy. I tried it. It was stuck, but I managed to force it open after a few tense minutes. The hinges groaned like they were in pain. Inside was a small storage room, cramped, with shelves holding old paint cans, a few rusty tools, and a stack of boxes that smelled like wet cardboard. I moved one aside and found a trapdoor beneath it. I paused, feeling a flush of adrenaline. The trapdoor led to a basement I hadn't known existed. It wasn't a full basement, just a narrow crawl space, but it was enough to hold something large. I took out my flashlight and shone it down. The beam landed on a series of muddy footprints. They were fresh, no more than a few days old. My heart started beating faster. I had thought this place had been abandoned for years. Who else was here? I decided I needed to check the perimeter outside while it was still light. The cabin was surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides and a small clearing in front. As I circled it, I noticed signs of someone living rough. A makeshift fire pit with cold ashes, a tattered tarp draped over some logs like a shelter, and more footprints leading off into the trees. The realization hit me that I was not alone. The forest that seemed so serene and inviting now felt threatening. Each shadow a potential movement I couldn't see. Night was falling faster than I expected. I returned to the cabin, setting up a small camp near the fire pit to keep the chill at bay. I tried to focus on practical things, checking the roof for leaks, clearing some of the debris from the floor, and getting my flashlight batteries ready. But the quiet was deafening. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I knew logically that deer or raccoons could account for the sounds, but something in me wasn't convinced. Around 10 p.m., I heard movement closer than the woods. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was pacing near the edge of the clearing, just out of the light. My stomach sank. I didn't have a weapon beyond a heavy wrench I'd brought for tools, but I wasn't planning to fight anyone. I crouched behind the cabin, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. Then a low, scraping sound came from the back window. Whoever it was had leaned against the glass, testing it, trying to see inside. I could see the faint outline of a person, hunched, cautious. Panic rose, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered my old phone, though the signal here was patchy. I turned it on, dialing 911 while keeping my flashlight trained on the window. There was no answer. The person had vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. I stayed in the cabin for the rest of the night, sleeping fitfully with the flashlight clutched in one hand and the wrench in the other. Every sound made me sit up, heart pounding, until the first weak light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Morning revealed more about the intruder. The tarp shelter had been abandoned, but the fire pit was still warm. Footprints led deeper into the forest, but I saw signs that someone had left in a hurry. Scattered belongings, a knocked-over log, and some food wrappers that hadn't been there the day before. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. The cabin needed repairs, yes, but it wasn't safe. I packed up everything I could carry and made my way back down the hill. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest swallowed the cabin again, as though it had never existed. I told myself it was the right decision, that there was no reason to stay and tempt trouble. But the unease didn't leave me even years later. I never went back, and I never spoke about it to anyone. Not my ex, not Madeline, not even friends. The memory of the place, of the footsteps, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me. A reminder that even ordinary, abandoned places can hold danger, and that curiosity can be far riskier than you expect. The cabin still exists, somewhere under those red and gold trees, slowly rotting into the earth. I know I could go back, inspect it, and maybe finally fix it, but I won't. I have enough memories of that night to last a lifetime. Some things I decided are better left as they are, unvisited and unprovoked. And that's the lesson I carried away. The world has corners where normal rules don't apply, where the line between abandoned and occupied is thinner than you think, and where curiosity can lead you far further than you ever intended. It was the summer of 1997, and I had decided to take a solo trip up in northern Maine, somewhere close to the border with Canada. I had always loved solitude, and after working long hours in a small construction firm in Portland, I needed a break. My plan was simple: hike deep into the woods for a few days, sleep rough, and spend time thinking. I packed a small backpack with essentials: some canned food, a water filter, a blanket, and my old, reliable hunting knife, and set off early one morning, leaving my beat-up Chevy parked at the edge of a dirt logging road. I had been walking for hours when I first noticed the cabin. From a distance, it looked almost picturesque, sitting at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by pine and birch trees. But the closer I got, the more I realized it was anything but welcoming. The wood was gray and splintered, the roof sagging in the middle as if it had given up long ago. The windows were dusty and cracked, some missing panes entirely, and the front door was hanging unevenly on rusted hinges. I don't know why, but something about it made me pause. Most of the time, an abandoned cabin like this would have excited me. It had history, but this one felt wrong. I circled it cautiously. The ground around it was uneven and littered with broken branches and dried leaves. There were no signs of recent human activity, no footprints, no trash, nothing. But the air felt heavy, as though the cabin was holding its own silence against the forest. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a faint metallic smell, almost like rust mixed with damp soil. I pushed the door open slowly, and it groaned in protest. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for a few rotting pieces of furniture. A cracked wooden table, a chair missing one leg, and a mattress that was little more than springs and stained fabric. Dust coated everything thickly, and I had to brush it off to see what was there. The smell was sharp and musty, a mix of mold and decay. Sunlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The silence was intense, not the kind of quiet where you can hear birds chirping, but the sort of quiet that presses in and makes your own breathing sound too loud. I moved further in, examining the cabin. The back wall had a small, boarded-up opening, which looked like it might have been a window once. The floor creaked under my weight, and I had to be careful not to step on loose boards. As I explored, I noticed scratches on the walls, deep, uneven gouges that didn't look like animal marks. I froze, trying to convince myself that maybe a bear had clawed at the wood years ago, but the pattern didn't make sense. They looked deliberate, like someone had used a knife or an axe. The sun was starting to drop when I decided I would stay the night. My plan had been to find a tent site, but this cabin was sheltered and offered some protection from the wind and cold. I stacked a few of the wooden planks lying around to sit on, covered the mattress with my blanket, and settled in. As darkness fell, the cabin seemed to shift. The shadows grew longer and sharper, the air colder and thicker. I lit a small camping stove to heat some water for dinner. The flickering flame made the shadows dance, exaggerating every crack in the walls. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. A scraping, dragging noise coming from the corner of the room near the boarded-up window. I froze, holding my breath. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, slower this time, like someone or something was moving the boards. My heart was pounding. I had been in the woods plenty of times, seen bears and wolves, even the odd moose, but this felt different. This was human. I grabbed my knife and moved toward the sound, careful not to make too much noise. The boards were old and brittle, and as I touched one, it gave way slightly under my fingers. I could see the gap where light from the moon outside spilled in. My stomach turned when I realized it wasn't the wind at all. Someone had been here recently, maybe not long before me. I stayed awake the entire night, listening to every creak, every distant snap of a twig outside. I didn't hear anyone enter the cabin, but the sense of being watched was constant. I slept in short bursts, never fully letting my mind rest. By the time dawn arrived, I had made a plan. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things carefully, trying not to make noise, and left the cabin behind, keeping my eyes on the surrounding trees the whole way back to the logging road. I drove back to Portland as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. The trip left me rattled, but I couldn't stop thinking about those scratches and the sounds I heard. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I researched old records for the area and found a brief mention in a local paper from the late 80s. The cabin had belonged to a man who had vanished without a trace. Locals suspected foul play, but the case went cold. There were no arrests, no evidence, just an abandoned cabin that eventually fell into disrepair. I realized then what had unsettled me so much. Not the isolation, not the dark, not the creaking wood, but the idea that someone had been here, alive and desperate, and something had gone terribly wrong. I had been lucky. The cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by reality, by human choices and mistakes that left traces you could still feel years later. After that trip, I never went back to northern Maine alone. I took smaller hikes closer to home, stuck to areas where other people were around. I kept my survival instincts sharp, my knife within reach, and I never dismissed the sense of caution that first gripped me in that cabin. But I also never forgot the smell of that damp, rotting wood, the way the shadows moved across the floor, or the sound of someone or something dragging against the walls in the dead of night. It stayed with me, a reminder that some places carry history you don't want to become a part of. Years later, I told a friend about it while showing him pictures of the Maine woods. He laughed and said I was exaggerating, but I knew he couldn't understand. Some things you experience alone, and some places you feel in a way that goes beyond logic. The cabin was abandoned, but it left its mark. I never returned. I don't think I ever will. The memory lingers. Even now, if I close my eyes and picture that cabin, I can feel the floor creaking beneath me, smell the rot and mold, see the pale moonlight slicing through broken windows. I can almost hear the dragging sound from that night, the reminder that human absence does not mean safety, and that sometimes the scariest things are the things left behind.